It was a night Steve Harvey would never forget. The lights were dim, the air thick with a kind of silence that only comes when truth is about to reveal itself. He sat alone, staring at a glass of wine in front of him, red glimmering under the soft glow of the room. It wasn't the first time he'd been offered a drink, but something inside him had changed. He had seen too much. He had heard too much. And deep down he knew this wasn't just about a drink. It was about something far deeper, something that reached into the soul of mankind itself. He remembered that night in Dubai, years ago, when a man in a white robe had told him words that echoed through his mind even now. "Brother," the man said, "the first drop of alcohol may taste sweet, but it's the beginning of a fire that burns silently inside." Steve had laughed back then, not out of disrespect, but confusion. He couldn't understand how something that brought people joy could also bring them ruin. But that was before he saw the truth, before he saw how the world hides its pain behind laughter and luxury. He began to notice things. The way people at parties laughed too loud, their smiles stretching just a bit too wide. The way conversations turned into arguments, and how friends became strangers over bottles and pills. He saw men with broken homes, women with haunted eyes, and youth wasting away, all chasing a feeling that never stayed. He thought of the man's words again, that voice calm yet filled with sorrow. "Allah forbade it not to punish you, but to protect you from yourself." Steve's voice trembled when he shared the story once on his show. The audience didn't move, not a whisper, not a cough. He told them how he had read about the Prophet Muhammad, how alcohol, once common among Arabs, was slowly banned by revelation, not in one command, but in steps, as if God himself was teaching humanity patience, leading them from darkness into understanding. First, the verses came reminding people of the harm that outweighed the pleasure. Then another, forbidding them from prayer while intoxicated. And finally, the verse that shattered all excuses, commanding, "Leave it. So will you not stop?" Steve's voice lowered, almost like a whisper to the heart. He said, that's not a rule. That's mercy. He remembered sitting in a hospital once, waiting for a friend whose liver had collapsed. The smell of disinfectant, the sound of machines, the shallow breathing, it all clung to his memory like smoke. He looked around and saw men younger than him, destroyed by addiction, eyes empty, hands trembling. He thought of the billions spent, the lives lost, the families broken. If alcohol was truly freedom, he said quietly, why does it change so many? There was a pause, the kind of silence that weighs heavy on the soul. He leaned forward and said, Islam doesn't just say don't drink. It says, protect your mind, protect your heart, protect your soul. Because when those are gone, you're not you anymore. He had once thought religion was about control, about rules. But as he studied more, listened more, something clicked. He realized Islam didn't ban what was enjoyable. It banned what destroyed joy itself. It wasn't fear that shaped those commands. It was love, a love that didn't want to see you wake up in regret or lose yourself to a moment's pleasure. He recalled a story he'd heard from an imam about a man who came to the Prophet addicted to alcohol. The man confessed, ashamed, and asked to be forgiven. The Prophet didn't condemn him. He prayed for him. Again and again, the man returned, failing, begging for mercy. Yet the Prophet said to his companions, do not curse him, for he loves Allah and his messenger. Steve paused there, his voice cracking, saying softly, even in his weakness, God saw his heart. He looked down at that glass one last time. The reflection staring back wasn't the man he used to be. It was someone reborn through understanding. He pushed the drink away, not because he feared punishment, but because he finally saw the purpose. He said, when God tells you no, it's not rejection, it's protection. And as he walked out into the night, the city lights seemed different. The noise, the chaos, the laughter, it all looked like echoes of people searching for peace in the wrong places. He smiled faintly, whispering to himself, I've found mine in the silence after saying no. For the first time in years, Steve felt sober, not just in body, but in spirit. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't chasing a feeling. He was simply free. The night was still. A strange calm covered the city, as if even the wind had paused to listen. Steve walked down the empty street, his breath visible in the cold air. The streetlights stretched long shadows across the pavement, and with every step, he felt the weight of something unseen, like life itself was whispering, you've just begun to see. He had given up the glass, but not the thoughts that came with it. Because quitting wasn't the hard part. Understanding why he needed to in the first place was. The silence of the night was louder than the noise of his old life. It carried memories, mistakes, people. He thought of the laughter that used to fill the rooms he once partied in. Laughter that always ended in tears when the lights went out. He remembered the faces, the smell of liquor, the empty words of happiness people kept repeating to convince themselves they were fine. But now, after all he'd seen, he couldn't lie to himself anymore. A few days later, he found himself invited to a private event, a charity dinner, high quiet, surrounded by the kind of people who wore smiles like masks. He hadn't planned to drink, but as he sat there, the waiter approached with a golden tray, crystal glasses glimmering under the chandelier. The scent of old habits returned, smooth, warm, and deceitful. The room filled with laughter, toast, and the clinking of glass. Steve stared at the cup in front of him, watching the liquid swirl. He could hear it in his head again, that soft voice from Dubai. The first drop tastes sweet, the next. You didn't touch it. Instead, he looked around, studying the faces. Behind the laughter, he saw pain, a kind he now recognized. One man was forcing a smile while his eyes kept drifting to his phone. Another woman laughed loudly but looked empty, her makeup hiding tears that hadn't fallen yet. A couple at the next table whispered between fake smiles, pretending for the world that they were happy. And in that moment, Steve realized everyone in that room was running from something they didn't want to face. Regret, guilt, loneliness, fear. They weren't drinking to celebrate. They were drinking to forget. When he left that night, he didn't go home. He drove aimlessly until the city disappeared behind him. He ended up by the water, a small lake under a moonlit sky. The reflections trembled on the surface like broken glass. He sat on a bench, his hands folded, his eyes lost in thought. He whispered to himself, "Why do we destroy ourselves to feel alive?" There was no answer, just the sound of the wind brushing across the lake. He thought about the stories he'd read, the history of nations lost not to war, but to indulgence. Civilizations collapsing because pleasure became their god. He thought about how Rome fell, not just from invaders, but from within, the wine, the decadence, the moral decay. And he realized maybe that's what Islam had always tried to warn against, not just alcohol, not just drugs, but the corruption of the soul that comes when desire rules over discipline. Steve started to feel something strange, a pull inside him like a voice urging him to learn more, not from books this time, but from people. So he called an old acquaintance, a scholar he had once met during a TV interview, a quiet man with soft eyes and a calm smile, someone who spoke not to argue, but to awaken hearts. They met in a small masjid on the outskirts of town. It was almost empty, just a faint light glowing from inside. Steve hesitated before walking in. The smell of clean carpet, the gentle echo of his footsteps. It all felt sacred, untouched. He sat quietly as the imam finished his prayer and turned toward him. "I knew you'd come back," the imam said softly. Steve gave a tired smile. "Yeah," he said. I can't shake the feeling that I'm seeing the world differently now. Like I've been asleep my whole life." The imam nodded. "Most people are, until pain wakes them." Steve looked down his low. "Why does Islam forbid these things? Alcohol, drugs, why take away something that feels so easy to escape with?" The imam folded his hands, thinking carefully before speaking. "Because ease is not always peace, Steve. The devil does not destroy people with violence. He destroys them with comfort. Alcohol and drugs are not the cause of evil. They are the tools. They numb the pain that was meant to wake you up." Steve listened, silent. "God doesn't forbid to limit you." The imam continued, "He forbids to free you. Because when you depend on a bottle to silence your thoughts, you've already surrendered your soul. And he loves you too much to watch you do that." The imam's words hit him like a mirror shattering. Every memory, every regret, every night he tried to drown came rushing back. He realized how many years he had wasted pretending he was in control. The imam handed him a small booklet, verses from the Quran translated into English. "Read these when you're alone," he said. "Let them speak to you, not through logic, but through silence." That night, Steve went home and opened the book. The first verse he read was, "And do not approach intoxicants, for they are abominations of Satan's handiwork. Will you not then refrain?" He read it again and again. The words didn't sound like commands. They sounded like pleas, like a father begging his child not to walk in a fire. He closed the book and sat still. The clock ticked. Outside, the city lights flickered, and somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. He thought about all the times he'd seen those sirens. Accidents, fights, broken lives, all beginning from the same glass. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. It wasn't superstition anymore. It was truth. In the weeks that followed, Steve began visiting the mosque more often. Not as a celebrity, not as a speaker, but as a student. He sat quietly in the back, watching men stand shoulder to shoulder in prayer. No titles, no wealth, no separation. Just unity. He noticed something else too, their peace. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forced. It was the kind of peace that comes from surrendering, not running. And it made him wonder, how could people who gave up so much look so content while the rest of the world, drowning in pleasure, looked so empty? One day after prayer, a young man approached him. "Brother Steve," he said, "I used to drink. I used to think I could control it, but it controlled me." He lifted his sleeve slightly, a scar on his wrist. "Islam didn't save me from alcohol," he said. "It saved me from myself." Those words stayed with Steve for days. He realized every story he was hearing had the same pattern: fall, pain, surrender, peace. Maybe that was the rhythm of redemption. But not everyone around him understood. Some friends mocked him. "You've changed," they said. "You're letting religion control your life." He smiled and replied, "No, it's teaching me how to live mine." Yet deep down, there was still a storm inside him. The more he learned, the more memories surfaced. The people he'd lost to addiction. One night, he sat alone watching old clips of his show, the ones where guests laughed about a little drink. He couldn't even smile. All he saw now were people hiding pain behind applause. Then one morning, he received a call. A close friend, someone he had partied with years ago, was gone. Overdose. They found him alone in a hotel room with a bottle on the table. Steve dropped the phone. The world around him blurred. His hands shook. He felt something crack inside, the kind of grief that feels like punishment. He drove to the funeral, quiet, numb. The room was filled with people pretending to mourn but avoiding guilt. The same people who once cheered his friend's habits now whispered, "He should have stopped." Steve stood at the coffin, staring down at the face of a man who once laughed louder than anyone. He whispered, "You didn't deserve this." But deep inside, he knew they all played a part. The world that called destruction fun, the culture that called weakness freedom, the media that made poison look like pride. He clenched his fists and thought, how many more? That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker again, the same lights that had once blinded him. He whispered to himself, "This is why God said no." He thought about the verse again. Satan only wants to sow enmity and hatred among you through intoxicants and gambling, and to avert you from the remembrance of Allah and from prayer. So will you not desist? It wasn't just about alcohol. It was about the chain reaction, the broken homes, the crimes, the regrets, the souls lost. Every drink was a drop of fuel to a fire the world refused to see. Steve decided that night he wouldn't stay silent anymore. He began to speak, not as a preacher, but as a witness. On stage, on interviews, he talked about what he'd seen, the cost of false happiness, the lies behind just one drink. Some called him extreme, others called him brave, but he didn't care. He had seen the darkness and he couldn't unsee it. One evening, after a long talk in a university hall, a young woman approached him, tears in her eyes. "My father died because of alcohol," she said. "I used to hate God for taking him away. But now, I think maybe God was trying to take him away from the bottle." Steve didn't respond. He just nodded and placed a hand on her shoulder. There were no words left, only understanding. Time passed, but the journey never really ended. Every day was a reminder, every story another warning. He kept reading, learning, growing. Islam became not a subject he studied, but a mirror he looked into, showing him the man he was meant to be. And slowly, he began to feel it. That peace he'd once seen in the mosque. Not excitement, not thrill, just peace. The kind that doesn't fade when the music stops. The kind that doesn't need a drink to feel alive. Yet, in the quiet hours before dawn, he sometimes sat by the window and thought of those still trapped. People laughing in pain, living in denial, calling their chains freedom. He prayed for them, whispering, "May they see what I've seen." One morning, while filming a new project, the director suggested they do a toast scene for the finale. Glasses of champagne, lights flashing. Everyone agreed, everyone but him. He looked at the glasses, then at the faces around him. He shook his head gently and said, "Find another way to celebrate. I don't raise poison to success." There was silence. The crew exchanged glances. Then, slowly, one by one, they set their glasses down. Someone replaced them with cups of water. When they raised their hands again, it wasn't just a toast. It was a quiet rebellion against a world that sells death with a smile. That night, as Steve drove home, he felt the kind of pride that comes from peace, not applause. The sky was dark, but he saw light everywhere, in the reflections of street lamps, in the stars, in the quiet strength of saying no. He whispered to himself, "I finally understand." The bands weren't about control. They were warnings from a creator who knew the human heart too well, who knew how easily pleasure becomes prison. The truth wasn't dark anymore. It was blindingly clear. He thought of that first night, the glass on the table, the reflection staring back. And he smiled. That man was gone. What remained was someone who had seen the edge of destruction and stepped back. The city slept around him, unaware of the war being fought in hearts every night. But Steve knew he'd fought his and he'd won. And somewhere deep in the silence of the night, it felt as if the heavens whispered back, "You chose life.